It was a beautiful afternoon in town. The sun was shining, the streets were alive with the sounds of cars, street vendors, and people walking around trying to enjoy the day. In a working-class neighborhood, on the corner of a cobbled street, a scene would take place that would forever mark memories. Miriam Johnson, a 72-year-old black woman, walked slowly along the sidewalk, her basket of vegetables full of vegetables in her arms. She was known in the neighborhood for her wisdom and kindness. Every day, she took this same route to get to the small local grocery store. She was a woman who had seen hard times, but still stood tall. Despite her advanced age, she had the energy to live, to share her stories and her smiles with the neighbors. That day, however, a shadow fell over her. A police officer, one Agent Collins, was stationed nearby. The man, a white police officer with hard features and a stern look, had already been talked about for deplorable behavior. He was known for his prejudices and authoritarian temperament. But that day, something inside him seemed even more irritated. He observed the passers-by with a sort of palpable distrust. Miriam walked slowly, her steps measured on the cobblestone sidewalk, her hands holding tightly to a basket full of fresh vegetables. To him, the street was like an old friend, familiar and reassuring. Every corner, every building had a story. She had been crossing the same avenues for years, the locals greeting her with a smile or a wave of the hand. It was her neighborhood, a place where she had seen generations grow up, where the voices of her neighbors mixed with the sounds of daily life. But that day, a shadow suddenly fell over her. She hadn't noticed Agent Collins until he made a sudden movement towards her, his white uniform gleaming in the sun. He stood there, like a menacing figure blocking his path. "Hey you! You over there!" he shouted, his rough voice cutting the air.
"You look like you're hanging around.
Why aren't you at home at your age?" The tone was abrasive, almost accusatory. Miriam froze, surprised by this sudden aggression. She was far from a stranger in this neighborhood, and she had never been spoken to like this before. She slowly turned her head towards him, her eyes expressing first confusion, then slight incomprehension. "Excuse me, sir, I'm just on my way home," she replied calmly, her voice laced with a wisdom she had acquired over the years.
"Why talk to me like that?"
Agent Collins didn't seem to ease his words. Instead, he approached quickly, closing the space between them with a threatening gait. His gaze, already hostile, became even more piercing, as if he was trying to dominate her with his authority. "Don't tell me what to do, old lady," he replied in a contemptuous tone. "You don't have to hang around this area. This is an area for people like me, not for people like you." Miriam felt her heart tighten in her chest. These words, heavy with racial innuendo, struck harder than any blow. She didn't answer right away. She had seen, experienced, and felt the violence and contempt of years past, but this kind of wanton brutality affected her more than usual. However, she remained calm. She knew that in times like this, dignity was her most precious weapon. She was no stranger to injustice, but each new attack always seemed a little more difficult to bear. Passers-by, curious at first, began to stop, attracted by the scene taking shape before them. Eyes met, but no one dared to intervene. People looked away, remaining silent, fearing the repercussions of any action. Miriam knew it all too well, the fear of state power and the immobility of those who witnessed injustice. "I'm going to have to take you in for a document check," Agent Collins said in a threatening voice, as if he took pleasure in abusing his power to further humiliate the old lady. Miriam felt a shiver run down her spine. She was no longer a simple, rule-abiding citizen. To him, she was just a nuisance to be eliminated. She took a deep breath, trying to regain the calm her years had taught her. But a part of her began to rebel, a part that refused to give in to this humiliation. Just then, like lightning striking the scene, a firm hand landed on his shoulder. The sudden intrusion startled Miriam, but it was not a threatening presence. It was a calm, but determined force that enveloped him. She turned her head and saw Mike Tyson. Tyson, dressed simply in a t-shirt and gym pants, was an imposing man. His stature, broad shoulders and penetrating gaze immediately captured the attention of those standing there. He was not a stranger. This man was a legend, but today he embodied something bigger than fame. He embodied justice. "I think you got the address wrong, buddy," Tyson said, his voice low and calm, but full of determination. He didn't need to shout for his words to sound like an order. His eyes glowed with a quiet intensity, devoid of fear, a silent force that invaded space. Agent Collins turned quickly to him, a glint of annoyance in his eyes. He wasn't used to taking orders, especially not from a man like Tyson. "It's a police matter," he retorted, visibly irritated. "You have nothing to do here, sir.
Go on your way."
Tyson stood up straighter, his posture suddenly straighter, more imposing. "No, I'm going to stay here." "You're going to stop touching that woman," he said, his tone now firmer. His arms crossed with an assurance that left no doubt as to his intentions. Agent Collins, increasingly agitated, took a step toward Tyson, perhaps thinking he could scare the boxer with his own intimidation. "It's my job," he cried.
I do what I want here.
"You don't have to say anything." But Tyson didn't move an inch. The silence between the two men seemed to grow stronger by the second, each tension in the air becoming more and more palpable. The crowd watched, silent but attentive. Tyson's words resonated in the soul of each of the witnesses. It wasn't just a physical fight. It was a clash of principles. Dignity against brutality. "If you touch one of his hairs," Tyson snapped, "you'll be dealing with me." The now numerous passers-by observed the scene with intense attention. The sound of whispers began to spread among the crowd, some exchanging looks of silent understanding, others silently pulling out their phones, capturing every moment of this confrontation. The tension was palpable, almost electric. People knew, deep down, that what they were seeing was not just an altercation between a police officer and an old lady. It was a clash between two realities, two worldviews that collided. They had all seen the injustice, the weight of misplaced authority, but none of them had the courage to stand up. Not until then. Agent Collins, realizing the situation was getting out of hand, looked down, as if hoping the ground might offer him an escape. The fear was now palpable in his eyes. But the pride and arrogance that had inhabited him for years still had one last word to say. "I'm just doing my job," he tried to justify, his voice trembling, a little less confident. He had said those words like a lifeline, desperate to convince himself that he was right, despite the evidence to the contrary. "Your job is to escort people in a respectful manner, not to humiliate and beat them," Tyson replied, his voice calm, but full of power. He did not raise his voice, but every word seemed stamped with the seal of truth, implacable. "So now you're going to leave, and you're going to leave this woman alone." It wasn't just asking the agent to leave. It was a statement of intent, an act of justice that highlighted the dehumanization Collins had just imposed on an innocent person. Agent Collins, visibly distraught, suddenly felt confronted with something he did not understand. The man standing before him was not only a celebrity, a sports legend. He was a man whose integrity and sense of humanity seemed far greater than his own insecurities. He was a man who, despite fame and wealth, chose to use his power and influence to defend an innocent woman. It was not an act of heroism like the ones he saw in the movies, but an action rooted in truth and justice. Collins felt a wave of humility he hadn't felt in a long time. In his uniform, he had become accustomed to imposing his power, but he had never had to face a man who used it not to dominate, but to protect. Agent Collins slowly backed away, his pride bruised, and gave Tyson one last angry look before walking away. His steps were hesitant, as if he was trying to regain his composure. But he knew, deep down, that this wasn't a victory. Not for him, nor for the police. No, this time the line between good and evil had been drawn, and he had crossed the wrong one. In the minds of the witnesses, the agent was nothing more than a ridiculous silhouette, a symbol of the injustice he embodied. Miriam, although trembling, felt immense relief spreading through her. The fear that had invaded her a few minutes earlier was slowly dissipating, replaced by a new sensation, recognition. She turned her gaze to Tyson, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, my boy," she said in a soft, trembling voice, but full of emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me." It was more than just a thank you. It was the expression of a life marked by injustice, pain, but also resilience. Today, someone had chosen to fight for her. Tyson smiled at him, a smile that carried the warmth of genuine human brotherhood. "It's the least we can do," he replied, his eyes full of understanding. "No one deserves to go through this." He had seen thousands of fights in his life, in and out of the ring, but this scene, this woman who had been humiliated for no reason, had awakened something deeper in him. This was not simply an act of protection. It was a repair. A return to fairness, however minimal it may be. The witnesses who had witnessed the scene began to applaud, their hands beating the air in sincere gratitude. The applause resonated like a wave of collective approval, an affirmation that, despite daily injustices, there were times when justice triumphed. The phones, which until then had captured Miriam's humiliation, were now filming an act of solidarity and humanity. For the first time, the story unfolding was one of reparation, not injustice. Agent Collins, as he walked away, realized that he would never return to this neighborhood the same way. His reputation, already weakened by his abusive behavior, was now permanently tarnished in everyone's eyes. But that was nothing compared to the profound impact that Tyson's action had just created. There was a red line, invisible but yet tangible, that could not be crossed without consequences. Mike Tyson had just traced it with implacable precision, and the crowd, the passers-by, had seen it. Miriam, although still a little shaken by the intensity of the incident, regained her balance. She felt a deep relief settle within her, a newfound strength. She continued on her way, but this time, she was not alone. Tyson followed her for a few steps, as if to make sure she felt safe, that she found her way without further fear. Then he stopped on a street corner, gave her one last sincere smile, and turned to leave. "Take care of yourself," he told her before walking away, his face calm, his powerful body blending into the crowd. The scene they had just experienced, this confrontation, would remain engraved in the memory of those who had experienced it. But more importantly, it would be told to those who weren't there, as a symbol of what to do in the face of injustice. Miriam was no longer just a victim, but a woman who had been heard. And Mike Tyson, far from being a mere sports hero, had become a living witness to the humanity and dignity that should be afforded to everyone, regardless of age, color, or status. The passers-by who had witnessed the event gradually dispersed, but their conversation was now different. They talked to each other about what they had seen, what they had felt, but above all, about the truth that had just been forcefully stated. Injustice, however entrenched, could be challenged. And that day, a man had the courage to do it.